early to this live stream, I will probably cut out the beginning. So if you're just joining, welcome. This is our weekly contributor live stream on the open source Aqua open source channel. And our goal is basically to hear from contributors to our open source projects, but also from open source contributors, enthusiasts in the space, also with different backgrounds, experiences, different career paths, since there are multiple ways to contribute to open source, not just PR. So we want to really represent those as well. The next time, in 2 weeks, actually, because next week I'm off, but in 2 weeks, we will actually have Engin, who's also in the chat right now. He's going to join in 2 weeks because he's also contributing lots to the open source, to the cloud native space. So do subscribe to this channel to stay up to date. Also, if you want to engage in the chat, if you want to ask any questions to Hannah, just subscribe and you can talk in the chat. And I'm seeing your comments, even though we're on Zoom. But yeah, no, I just want to welcome you, Hannah. Thank you so much for taking the time again. Just maybe let us know who you are. What is your job title? And I love to ask people who are on this live stream about one unique fact about themselves. Anything that you think is like really cool about you.
Okay. Well, first, I'm Hannah, and I am a developer advocate at Hubspot. And I guess, one interesting fact, I started not tech related at all. I started baking. So I feel like there's always hobbies you should have on the side, and that's about it. So I've been making bread. And if you follow me on Twitter, it's like all this like technical content, open source. And then it's like, here's a loaf of bread. And you're like, okay.
That's great. It's not just okay. It's great. I love that fun. You're sharing something out of your day to day, right? You're more than what you do for your job or what your technical interests are, right? And I think there's a really healthy balance always. So on your day to day, like you just joined HubSpot. 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 Sorry. What is your day-to-day like at HubSpot? Is there already a day-to-day? Like, what do you usually do? What kind of technologies do you spend your time on?
That's a good question. Because I feel like, especially with developer advocacy, there's all different types. And so we're always doing so many different things. And at HubSpot right now, what I'm doing is what's different about HubSpot compared to other advocacy or development roles is that it is a product. They have a CRM platform for like marketing and small businesses and medium businesses. And I'm trying to like research and connect with developers who are customizing the CRM platform with their API. And before I joined HubSpot, and even before I got into advocacy, I worked several years as an API developer, focusing on like .NET and C#. And so, as far as like the tech base that I'm working with now, it's kind of an array of things. It's, I'm trying to get better with Python. There's a lot of JSON, JavaScript, and, utilizing Postman for API calls. So that's essentially where I'm at. And I guess I'm always just trying to connect with developers, build content that developers need for HubSpot. Like, how do I make a batch request for emails or for a contact? How do I make this customization? So it's more or less just trying to find solutions for these common questions, which I think a lot of us advocates, that's what we do. We try to find resources or build it for folks who have questions.
Totally. You already answered my next question of what did you do before HubSpot? So you worked as engineer. How did you hear about developer advocacy? What got you interested in developer advocacy? Because you kind of have different career roads into developer advocacy, right? I didn't take the engineer first route. I went straight from something else into developer advocacy before being an engineer first. Now you had engineering experience first. What was the point where you were like, oh, developer advocacy sounds like a cool thing, or where you even learned about developer advocacy and then you decided for yourself that's something you want to do?
It's a good question. So I guess to answer it first, as far as my background, because I went to a boot camp to learn object-oriented programming, and the reason I got into that was first because I was a project manager, and so I was working with smaller agencies, and I was working with groups of like UX designers, and I found myself, because I was working for such small shops, these, I was more, I guess, like client facing. And so clients would share their needs for a certain project that our team was working on, and they were just so swamped. They were so busy. So I was like, okay, well, I would try and just do some front end work and things like that, and learn about JavaScript and how to, CSS, HTML. And then I took it a step further, and I was like, oh, okay, this, I like this, because I realized, I think a lot of developers or just people in the tech field, we're solution based. So I was like, I want to find solutions for these clients. And so I had the time to find a boot camp where I rolled in like programming. And I did that for about 4 months, and then found got into development. And it wasn't until that I was a developer on a specific API team where I was working at an insurance company, and we had multiple development teams. And, we had traditionally just like these huge legacy systems, like these apps were just so clunky. They were poorly architected, and they were really hard to work with. And we wanted to build and find a solution, build applications that were scalable. And so we're like, okay, well, first, why don't we break down these legacy systems into APIs? But admittedly, a lot of our development teams didn't understand what an API was, how to design them, what were best practices, and even identifying the different types of APIs. And so it was my team that we were responsible for making sure these other teams that we were setting best practices for them and setting a standard. And so we ourselves were just like, okay, we got to figure this out. So our team, our development team, were the ones who just worked together to kind of create this outline, this foundation of like API development, and agree with it and do research. And then it was myself and one other colleague, James. I'll give him a shout out because he's just so smart and just so brilliant and just communicates so well. And James and I were able to craft together an API course. And we first started by, going team by team, each development team. And we started with like how to design an API. We were using Raml at the time to design these. And we were using a product, MuleSoft. And, we would pull the teams into the conference rooms, and we would walk them through a demo, and then we would do hands-on workshops with them. And these workshops were like, 3-4 hours. They were pretty robust, but it was so, I think for me, so gratifying to be able to like sit down with a developer and help them, and just say, oh, okay, you're running into this error. Let's try to fix this together. And it really got me excited, and that's what introduced me to advocacy. I didn't even really know what it was at the time when I was doing this. We were calling it an evangelist, and that's a whole other discussion: advocacy versus evangelism. I won't get into that.
We'll get into that in a second.
But it was like, I think also what helped was I had management that was supportive of this and was like, yes, like this is needed. We need this, and go for it. And I had that freedom. And so James and I think we had done over like 15 to 20 different training sessions, and we had built different tiers. We had built, design, build, and then implementation. And then from that, we would build API templates for other teams to utilize. And then we would just continue and build these courses that we were developing. And then we would also create courses for our quality assurance teams, our testers, that we would teach them like, what are components for testing APIs? What should, what should you do, what is important, and share different testing methodologies. And then also we worked with our business analysts, which were more or less kind of like a project manager. And the reason that we teach them the fundamentals of like what an API was and how it worked was so that when they were getting requirements from the business, because I worked for an insurance company, they needed to translate from the business to a developer, so that a developer understood, what do I have to build? What is required and what is needed? Yeah. So that was really important. And I think it is important for people who do work with developers to have at least some technical mindset, to have that sort of understanding, because it really does affect a project and its workflow and how successful you'll be. So, so that was a really good experience. And that was essentially kind of how I got my foot in the door. And then I think it was my friend James at the time who introduced me, was like, hey, because I was like, I want to take this a step further. And I, at the time, was also assigned like a Center of Excellence lead for our development teams. And that was more or less like just making sure development teams actually had the right tools. Like we were able to purchase the right tools for them to do their jobs effectively. So if we needed certain data, if we needed certain, just some sort of understanding metrics and visualizations of like our code and how it's working, and, you know, trying to prevent any sort of outage that would affect our end users, because it really did affect the business. And then that's how I just started researching developer advocacy roles, because I just realized like, oh, wow, this is an actual thing. This isn't something I'm just like building within this business. It's a real thing. And I honestly wasn't aware of that until a few years ago. So yeah, that's pretty much how it happened.
I love that story. It also shows how developer advocacy made you a better engineer, and it also improved your team, right? Internally, not just vice versa. Like usually I get asked, I hear the question of how does engineering benefit developer advocacy, but it goes the other way around. And I think that's something that a lot of people also kind of neglect in a way, of that it's really something that's essential internally. And like you highlighted, not just to teach engineers internally about new projects, new tools, or just standards that you want to enforce and validate within the business, right? But also beyond that. So yeah, I love that part. It's also, it feeds into the question of at what point should a business start developer advocacy? And I think there is no one point. You don't have to reach a certain level of maturity where you then all of a sudden need developer advocacy, right? Because there's so much that developer advocates can contribute early on towards the engineering team. But you also highlighted one point that I think is really interesting, which also kind of leads to discussion, where do developer advocates sit, right? Within the organization. And you were within the engineering team, and you just started to do internal developer advocacy, right? Which is another form of, which is like inwards facing instead of external, right? But in that case, it just makes sense to sit within the engineering team, right? What are your thoughts on that?
No, it's true, and I feel like as far as advocacy, I think where it actually ends up starting that gets overlooked is it's usually developers who are providing support, who are the ones when a developer has a question, doesn't understand something. It's someone with an advocate mindset that is willing to take the time to help them and to answer questions, and wants to help this person, you know, get through whatever roadblock they're facing. So I think a lot of it is like, it does stem from starting with support, like trying to support internally, and then you know, just seeing where that goes organically. So
what do you think some of the skills and qualities an engineer who is maybe thinking about entering developer advocacy, what should they start doing? What do you think kind of the focus, the outlook they should have? Like, do you think any engineer can become a developer advocate, or do you think there's some certain interests that you might want to work on or develop, or skills that could make it easier?
I think what would make it easier is, I guess, so something that I started first as well was I started like lunch and learns, and this is the time when everybody had started working from home. And so I wanted a way. I had noticed that there were development teams that weren't communicating, that were working on similar things, and that could help this other team that's struggling and working on something similar. So I started like lunch and learns and started kind of reaching out to developers to be like, hey, I know you're working on this and you're utilizing this new tool. Can you do a demo and share it with the group? And they were like, yeah, sure. And so I would just like send an email, an invite to like our entire development staff, and would just be like, hey, this is happening. I would schedule just a meeting and, you know, have this other developer share their screen and walk us through a demo. I mean, it really can be something that simple. And I think what helps in advocacy and to be an advocate is having empathy is a big thing. You know, I hate to see other people struggle, because something I think is also important in advocacy is having a good understanding of how you learn best. And I think, and I mean that by like, do you learn best from seeing examples, from visualization, like visuals? Do you learn best from reading, from, you know, doing something and struggling and learning that way? So I think having awareness of how you learn best, and also having awareness that maybe the way that you learn best isn't how others do. So if you're explaining something and someone's not understanding it, kind of taking a step back and saying, okay, well, how could I reframe this in a way that would help you and not me? And being able to have that dialogue. So definitely being able to reach out to people, to have that awareness, and to have empathy for others, to want to share resources, to want to help others. For me, at least, like that's something that's always been a passion, and I think what drives me towards advocacy.
Okay, this is kind of a separate question, but something that I hear pointed out quite a lot, that engineers are, I guess, how should I put it, not necessarily enthusiastic about going into those initiatives, because that obviously takes time away from them coding, right? And a lot of businesses don't necessarily value internal developer advocacy to the extent that it's promotional work, right? And with promotional work, I mean anything that will lead to the next position, right? Up the career ladder. So for example, if somebody is an engineer and they contribute lots to the documentation, it doesn't necessarily mean that their manager will recognize that as promotional work. So that might force or like kind of push engineers towards not contributing to that kind of work that can be classified as internal developer advocacy. But it sounds like from your experience that you had managers that were incentivizing the opposite, right? So what do you think from an engineering perspective, from a manager perspective, but also from a colleague perspective, they can do to help those who are interested in this internal developer advocacy work, for example? So let's assume, like, I mean, if somebody is willingly contributing to the documentation, right, then their team members should enforce it, should encourage that, right, of like getting the person to contribute more to the documentation, because then ultimately they don't have to do it. But at the same time, they shouldn't do it if it's on the expense of the other person getting promoted. So what are some of the suggestions that you would give colleagues that want to make it easier for this one person to contribute, or managers that want to make it easier for this one person to do internal developer advocacy?
That's such a great question. So, because it's not easy, you're right. Like there are people like, I don't have time with them. My manager won't let me do this. And it's true, because at first we had faced that guard, like that block where our executives and our senior leadership didn't value advocacy or any sort of like support, internal support, that wasn't us just coding and banging out like either tickets or just tasks or anything from your Asana board. And and so they're just like, anything that wasn't code related, they thought was a waste of time. But the thing was, I think I really just was lucky that I had management that understood the importance, because I think from a manager's perspective, and even from a business perspective, you have to think about the quality of your product, because if you have developers just adding feature after feature on top of something that is so brittle, that is going to break, and it's not going to have elasticity. It's not going to have scale. And I think eventually our management had realized that. And by allowing and making room, whether that's like an hour a week, whether it's, and I suggest asking that, ask your management, hey, I want to apply a goal for this quarter. I want to be better at, documentation. I want to be better at, even if you just want to improve your coding skills, asking for that and saying it in a way that I want to make this a goal, then it allows you it's a nice avenue to then make the time for that and explaining to your management that this is going to help me grow. This is going to help improve the team. I can share my knowledge with the team. It's only going to help us be better. And I think that's important because there definitely are those companies in that leadership where they're just like, no, like you're not, that's not a priority. And it's really hard to have those discussions, and it's really hard to push back. And if you can, I do encourage it, but come with a plan and come with, how you think this will benefit yourself as a developer and as a teammate, and how it will benefit the team, which will also benefit just your ecosystem, your morale and the company culture, which is super important. So yeah, I definitely suggest, trying first to apply it to your goals and having conversations with your managers, and the managers understanding that this is only going to help your teammate and your team, and create just a healthy atmosphere.
And also the business, right? Like from a perspective, you're just reminded me of the meme that I shared in my newsletter that I published today. So in each newsletter I publish at the end like a tweet of the week, which is just a funny meme. And this week I posted this meme of a senior engineer, like a junior engineer asking a senior engineer, where's the documentation? And the senior engineer responds, I'm the documentation. Now, if you have that kind of situation in your business, right, what happens is that if somebody leaves, they leave with the knowledge, with the understanding of the features and everything they implemented, right? And onboarding or understanding and detangling whatever they did before that senior engineer, right, will take far more time and will be expensive and maybe even more error prone than if you invest into documentation right from the start, right? So you just reminded me of that. And I think also what you highlighted is, and kind of at a higher level, is really that whether you do external developer advocacy, but also internal developer advocacy, you really have to proactively also advocate for yourself and for the work that you do. A lot of times, I guess, within developer advocacy, it can kind of be misunderstood of like, why are you spending your time on X, or why are you suggesting Y? And it's really about you being in a position where you feel comfortable speaking up and also providing like examples for your work, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. It is. It's definitely, and I have to admit, like when I did start getting into advocacy, that's a time when I was a developer and started to feel more confident about my skills. And so with that confidence, I was able to speak up and say, hey, like, we need this. And like you, in that meme, it just cracks me up because you gave me flashbacks of when I first started developing. And, I had like, a assigned mentor, and it was a senior dev. And he, I had notebooks, just notebooks of notes. And
whatever you were saying, you were just taking notes.
That sounds so old school, but it was like, it was just, because I would sit down with him at his desk, and he would walk me through something, and I would be like, okay, all right. Just take notes. And that was my documentation. It was kind of like my, just my guide. And I would keep that at my desk. And when I was working on something, and I'd be like, oh, he mentioned this, and I'd look up my notes, and I'd be like, okay. And then,
amazing. So, that is amazing. Now, moving on from developer advocacy, since this is an open source channel, right? Let's talk a little bit more about open source. You used to work at a company that I also used to work at called CodeFresh. And CodeFresh is heavily involved with a CNCF project called Argo CD, right? With Argo. Now, I don't know the most recent developments in that area, and I don't really that's not what I'm mentioning it, just to be completely frank. But I'm just curious about your experience specifically coming from a non-cloud native world, right? Like, as far as I understand, you haven't been working with cloud native technologies before that. Then you joined CodeFresh and you start working with cloud native tools such as Argo. How was that? What was that like? And how did you get started? And how did you find Argo and the ecosystem when you were starting? Yeah,
I know, right? Well, it's funny. Like when I talk about .NET and C#, people are like, "That what?" And it's like so archaic. I'm like, yeah, it's not sexy, it's not cool. But yeah, so when I got into advocacy, I joined CodeFresh, and it was like, what is Kubernetes? Like I just didn't, which is like, not a piece of cake. So, and I think also a very important attribute of advocacy, or just in general open source, you want the passion to learn, wanting to learn. So important. And so with CodeFresh, my experience there, that was a huge learning experience. Just learning about first what is open source. And I was really mad that I found out about open source projects and just the community so late in my development career, because I was, well, not late, I shouldn't say that, but just later on, because I really wished, because it provides so many resources. So kind of getting into CodeFresh and focusing on Kubernetes and just cloud applications, it was exciting. And I felt like what's so nice about this, specifically the cloud native industry, is there's so many resources. Like people there's such a wealth of knowledge, and there's so much you can find. And so I just loved it from like a student perspective, and really enjoyed learning everything, and obviously making a lot of mistakes, but just it was enjoyable. And so learning about continuous deployment and delivery, and what is that, and how can I be better at this? And so I think with CodeFresh, I was able to work with a lot of different tools and tech stacks. Specifically, I got to get involved a lot with Argo CD and the different projects, and also like focusing and being introduced to GitOps. And it made sense. And I think what was so an easy transition for me was that I was thinking of how everything I was learning now in the cloud native space could be applied to my prior positions when I was a developer. And I'm like, wow, this would have made our life so much easier. It would have been, and so I think it was that reason that had me so interested. And I wanted to also share resources with my old colleagues. And I was like, hey, this is what I'm learning. Like, have you tried out this tool? You should check out this project. I think you'd really enjoy learning this. And I just really enjoyed it. And I think with Argo specifically, it was something that was so, I don't want to say simple, because that it's not, but it allows your deployments to be just, I don't know, so much more visible, and just so much more a better understanding. Because as someone, for me, like my deployment processes in the past were a disaster. They were a mess. And I remember we had a Slack channel called like, I forget what it was, like the War Room or something. It was a terrible name. I don't support that. But it was just like, but that's where all of the development leads would be like, oh no, like what happened? Oh, we made this deployment. Oh, this crashed. And like seeing that chaos in real life, and then seeing these solutions that just make and mitigate those problems, I was like, wow, this is awesome. And I just, and also the popularity with Argo had increased so much, and there was a lot of content out there. And I think what also helped specifically at CodeFresh was working with someone, especially like I worked with Kostas Kapolonis, who at CodeFresh is also was a prior developer, and had worked at CodeFresh for a while, but was just a wealth of knowledge. And he really enjoyed teaching. And I'm sure you can attribute to this, where it was like, I would.
He's a great teacher.
He really is.
He's really providing you with amazing information. Like, big shout out to Costas, definitely.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
I just want to mention, like, also that I think that's one of the things Codefish does really well, that they have invested into junior developer advocates in the cloud native space. So, I mean, I was completely new to the cloud native space when I got started at Codefish as well, right? And they hired junior developer advocates, basically developer advocates who don't have experience in this space, and then help them to get onboarded and to learn about these technologies. And there's, like mentioned, there's a lot of great skills that also more junior developer advocates can provide, like, for example, creating the documentation based on the information gathered by more senior engineers to convey the information, how to use those projects, right? How do you get started and similar. So I think that's something they do very well. Yeah.
And I think honestly, like, he helped me a lot with just taking the time to have a one-on-one with me, and if there was something I didn't understand or I was getting stuck on when I was trying to work with something, he would take the time to, what is the, show me the problem. Okay. And then he would show me how to do it, because I definitely learned from example, and seeing him just kind of walk me through these steps and identify, what it was that I was misunderstanding. It's like, oh, okay. And I could kind of put the puzzle together in my head and have a better understanding, walk away with that, and then be able to help others from how he helped me learn. So definitely, like, kudos to those who are senior and are, like, want to help those junior colleagues. That helped a lot. And I think with Argo, something that I think was a big hit was I come up with like 10 best practices. Yeah. And admittedly, like, I'm not an expert, and I kind of leaned on the community for that one and was like, hey, like, this is pretty much an outline of what I have researched and from experience think is the most, important points that when someone wants to engage and utilize Argo CD specifically, here, this will help them. This will get them started, and they can ensure and feel confident that they're providing best practices. And then the community, which was just kind of a handful of people at the time, just gave me really great feedback. And I was like, okay, thank you so much. And then would do revisions and then went back to them. And that was really helpful. It helped me learn more about the project. Yeah. And so, yeah, I guess it just, I don't know, but it definitely was daunting. I remember going to Argo meetings, like, just like their monthly meetings, and feeling, being the person in the background on mute the whole time and just listening. Yeah. Because, definitely trying to get involved with a large open source project, it's intimidating. It definitely is. And I was introduced, I read an article about an open source community, and I'd reached out to the writer. Forgetting her name at the moment, so I apologize. But I reached out to her and was like, hey, I love this article. This is great. I've been wanting to contribute more to open source, like more on like a PR, like I want to contribute code, or I want to, start adding revisions. And because at CodeFresh, it was like, okay, you should start contributing. You should start like getting involved in these open source projects. But I didn't really have a good understanding of what that meant. Like, especially coming from like the more traditional, I think, I don't want to say traditional, but just the experience I had as a developer, that was very, it was just, I just wasn't used to it. And so I was introduced to someone named Divya Mohan, and she is actually a technical writer for Rancher. And her and I had a one-on-one, and I was like, how do I contribute to open source? Like, how do I do this? I'm intimidated. And, she had contributed to like Kubernetes documentation. She was a pro, and, she really has.
She's great.
She's
great.
Yeah.
She's also a CNCF ambassador. Yeah, she does an amazing job. Yeah.
And so
amazing shout out to her.
and so it was really her just kind of like, giving her feedback about start to attend the meetings, get familiar, post in Slack, engage with people. Because once you have a comfort amongst the like community themselves and start making those connections, then you feel comfortable making those contributions. And if you are going to submit, a large block of code or some sort of technical component, it's a good opportunity for learning. And if it doesn't get approved, that's okay. But that was such a good one, like discussion and just motivation to just go for it. You don't have to be perfect. And, but definitely also I should preface this with like any open source project, please read the contribution guidelines. Make sure you understand what is required to not make the maintainers' lives, too difficult.
Yeah.
They have a lot on their plate. But yeah, having having that engagement with her helped. And yeah, sorry, that was long-winded.
No, that was amazing. And I think also just reiterating on some of the things that you mentioned, right? For instance, last week I had somebody who did their first contribution to Trivy, to one of our open source projects on this channel, also for one of these live stream recordings. And I was asking them about their experience, and they never did any Golang programming, and they contribute for the first time to Trivy, and their like integrations, their features that they added are part of our most recent release. And we were talking about how you don't have to have extensive experience with a specific technology to get started contributing. And that's, I think, something I really like about this space, is that there's lots and lots of beginner content as well as more extensive content. Was that me? Sorry about that. My notifications. But yeah, so there's so much different content types as well, like in different skill levels and different focus, different areas, right? So there's really something for everybody, whether you're just getting started in a content space or you have already been contributing, right? There's something that you can find to get involved with, which makes the space so much more inclusive, right? And that's something that I really like. Now, something else that I wanted to ask you. So as a developer advocate, I mainly contribute, like also as an open source developer advocate, I mainly contribute to like the documentation, to examples, example projects. I create educational materials, such as some of the most recent videos on this channel, right? But I don't directly contribute to the source code a lot of times. Maybe like some changes, some bug fixes or something, but I wouldn't, like, I'm not the one who's like also really interested in adding features necessarily, to put it that way, right? So I just want to hear, like, what's your experience like, right? Do you think it's necessary to do that, to contribute to the source code, to be considered open source contributor? What are the different ways? What suggestions would you give somebody who's maybe not a developer advocate, but maybe not as comfortable contributing to the code base, right?
Yeah. No, that's a good question. Also, there are different contributions you can make to open source and open source project. Like you said, it doesn't have to be code. If it is, then by all means, if you see, I suggest code. If you want to submit a functionality, look at the issues and pick something that looks a little simple, just something to get you familiar with the code base of the project itself.
Yeah.
And then start there and then work your way up. But if you want to contribute that isn't code related, then like you had mentioned, you can start first with documentation. If you see any sort of typos, grammatical errors, punctuation, go ahead, submit that PR, and they'll thank you for it. But, oh, awesome. And also, like, you can provide examples, visuals, different types of projects or anything like that doesn't have to be code related. And also a contribution is sharing projects even. Just maybe you're not submitting a PR and you don't have that record, but just being able to share an open source project and to maybe create some sort of content or instructions or a use case and sharing that, so you're expanding the abilities of this open source project and also creating awareness for it. That's only going to bring more people to it who want to contribute and want to utilize it. So that's also a great contribution. So yeah.
Totally. Yeah, definitely. Now, I have one more main question, and then it kind of goes towards the end of the of my interview. But if there's somebody watching right now who has any questions to Hannah, myself, or Aqua Open Source, please do post them either in the live stream, or if you are watching the recording, post them in the comments below, and we answer them in the next live stream in 2 weeks. Also, thank you so much, Jonathan, for joining. It's really great to have you here. And also Engin and Chris, thank you for joining. So my next and more final major question, I guess, is that you mentioned earlier that you think you got started with open source quite late. Now, I imagine if you're an engineer at any point, and the thing is, I've only worked as an engineer in the open source space, I've worked before cloud native in the blockchain space where everything is also open source. Then the cloud native space is primarily open source, most of the stuff, right? So I don't really have a comparison, but I guess that most engineers would have some interaction with open source tooling, right? But you mentioned that you didn't at the point when you entered the cloud native space, you didn't quite know how to get involved in open source. What do you think would have made it easier, that transition, or to, I guess, for you to be more invited early on in the open source space? Was it specific to the technologies you were working with that you didn't feel like there was an entrance point? And how do you think this entrance point could have been created? And then in the cloud native space, do you think there's anything that the community could do to make the space more, or open source, particularly in contributions and ways to contribute, more visible and welcome?
That's a good question, because I think when I was a developer, I just wasn't looking in the right places. I wasn't active on social media. I wasn't really on Twitter. And that sounds silly, but I mean, we all share projects that we're excited about or that we're working on through these outlets and through different blogs. And I think I just wasn't aware or tuned in to these different platforms that were promoting these projects, and really understanding what is the cloud native space and understanding how it can help me as a developer. It was hard for me to make a connection, because to me it felt, and I even noticed this with my prior colleagues, there is still a disconnect. And even I feel like sometimes when I share resources with them, there's a bit of that's too much for me, or that doesn't apply to me. Yeah. And that's it could be a personal thing, but it was, I think for cloud natives, the community itself, if we want to increase the awareness and engage with other people who aren't aware, it's just about finding maybe different types of blog platforms or some sort of podcast, or just trying to kind of inch our way into other communities. Because I think with open source, it's very much like cloud native, and I feel like that's here. And then there are all these other developer communities around, and I just wish we could build a bridge and just say, hey, I think this could help this. So it really would take effort, and it would take research and identifying, those other spaces, those other tech spaces, and how we could bridge that gap between the two. Because honestly, I don't know if I would have taken such a strong route towards advocacy or documentation, because the reason that, I think I love open source so much is because before I struggled so much finding content and examples and resources that would help me as a developer. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I was like, well, I'm going to research, I'm going to create these resources. But then there's this whole other community out there that is doing that wants to answer questions, that wants to hear your questions. And I just honestly just wasn't aware of that. So I think it's upon the cloud native space to recognize those other development groups and reach out and let them know. I'm trying to do that. I'm trying to reach out to my old developer friends and just share what's going on and hey, check this out. And it's give or take, but yeah, I don't have a concrete answer for that.
Yeah, it's great. That's great. I think it's awesome. Like, I started looking at different events that are not necessarily cloud native first, but for example, at Java events, right, where I can speak at, okay, how do you scan your Java projects for vulnerabilities, things like that, just to get them more into like the cloud native space as well in some way, right? Of like, you must be creating, or like there must be projects that are creating containers, or using any parts of the technologies that I'm used. And
100%.
What you mentioned at the beginning of like the pain that you experience in the non-cloud native space, where you said, okay, once you got started in the cloud native space, you realize how much easier it would have been for your deployment process if you would have known about those technologies. Now, I don't know what's before cloud native, right? I only know cloud native. That's kind of like my, I guess, also shortcoming, that I'm trying like to understand, okay, how can we now bring that technology that I'm so familiar with to other parts, other people, other businesses that might not be as focused on it or might not know about it yet in that way, right? Now we have a question by Chris. Can Hannah give advice to those who are interested in advocacy but might be held back by imposter syndrome? How can they gain that courage? What helped you, or what helps you, I guess, on a daily basis to overcome? I guess like imposter syndrome is like, for me at least, something that I feel at least like every other day or something. So, which is normal, that at some point, if when you're working with new technologies or you're trying to implement something new, at some point you will have the thought of like, am I doing this correctly? Is this how you do it? Should I be doing this? I apologize for my notifications, but you have these thoughts of like, is this like any questions? I think like similar to those fall within imposter syndrome, right? So what helps you when those questions pop up? Like, what do you do about it?
Just punch them. It's hard. And because it's something I've always struggled with, and and I think it's interesting because I think the best remedy for imposter syndrome is speaking up and asking questions, because sometimes imposter syndrome is very internal. It's something, it's like a tornado in your head where you're trying to figure something out. You either like are shared some work and someone's like, what is this? Or it's just, so a lot of it is internal. And I think sometimes just asking questions to someone who might know something more or just have a better understanding of something, and asking them for clarity. Because honestly, it happened to me recently where I was trying to learn something new, and I was like, oh my gosh, like, why am I not getting this? Like, why is this not clicking? And, and then I met with one of our, someone who had been with the company for so long and was able to give me some context. It was like, no, like, this is complicated, and it's okay for you to feel confused. And I think we just need to be a little bit easier on ourselves and realize that, like, hey, you're trying to learn something, and if it just doesn't click right away, that's okay. Or if you're doing a talk and you're like, I don't know what I'm talking about, that's not true, because you wouldn't be here if you didn't. And so I think just feeling assured that like you've made it to this point and you're trying, and just I think being proud of yourself, just, like you said, like, it's like you first have to advocate for yourself and then be able to help others. So I think that's the biggest advice, is to just ask questions when you're feeling that way and it's just, spiraling.
No, that's a great advice. Also, just like in terms of asking questions, being more vocal than the voice in your head, right? Of like, because ultimately whatever is in your head, that's what you will think, and that's going to be self-enforcing of the perception that you have of yourself, of your work, right? So whenever you think these, or whenever you have the self-doubts, being more vocal, like also in terms of with your actions and the way that the things that you ask, or the things that you do, right, and with whom you're interacting with, should kind of work against that, right? Of like having people around you who tell you that you're doing an awesome job already helps, right? Like anything that counterbalances those thoughts, right? Just great advice. Now, as to my last question, what is next for you in the, I don't know, you just joined HubSpot, and what is next? Like, is there something like, it doesn't have to be work related, but is there something that you're looking forward to where like, okay, I want to achieve this? I saw that you started 100 Days of Python, right?
Yep.
That's
Yep.
one thing you want to learn Python. Yeah, tell us a bit more about the things that you're looking forward to. Like, I like to, close the episodes because a lot of these things are like backward facing, like, backwards looking of like, what have we done? But what is there that you're looking forward to that you are excited about and that you think maybe more people also should get excited about?
Yeah,
For example.
that's a wonderful question. Yes, so definitely I'm trying to get better and learn Python. I think, with HubSpot, my role there, I'm really just trying to research and connect with HubSpot developers and learn about what it is that they're doing, what can we do to make things better. So I'm very excited about that, and just being able to work with my team at HubSpot. They're such a great group of individuals, and I'm excited because admittedly developer relations is fairly new to HubSpot. So I think just seeing the impact that we can have for the developer community, and then maybe even kind of bleed into API development, and how can we also have an impact there and help developers there. So that is something I'm super excited about. HubSpot also we're doing a developer event in October called HubSpot Extend. And I'm excited about that because it's an opportunity to elevate HubSpot developer voices, and we want them to share, what are you working on? What is something that you learned? You're working with our API. Tell us more about that. And so we're giving them a platform to share those with the rest of the community. So I'm definitely excited to see that and help with that. But also I just want to continue to be involved in open source. I do want to push the boundaries. I do have a strong passion for diversity, inclusion, and belonging. I did start a guide for how advocates can be more inclusive with other advocates. So I do want to continue that effort and just continue to be a resource. People help them out. So.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing. That's really great. If you're watching and you have any questions to Hannah, her Twitter handle is, and also her GitHub, a link below. So check that out. I'm sure you can reach out directly to Hannah or tweet at her. Otherwise, if you want to comment on this live stream, then we can also either answer the comments in the future live streams, or I can forward them to Hannah, and Hannah can answer them here on YouTube as well. Thank you so much, Hannah, for taking the time. I know we had some technical difficulties, but it worked out in the end.
It did. It was great. Thank you so much. This is awesome.
So really great. Thank you. I hope everybody has an amazing day, and to see you on our next live stream, which is going to be in 2 weeks, with Engin, who has been contributing lots to Trivy, to our open source projects, and generally to the CNCF open source cloud native space. Thank you so much, Hannah. Thank you. Have an amazing day. Bye-bye.
Bye.